Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's learning session, Forests After Katowice, Updates on Global Policy, organized by WWF Forest and Climate. Thanks for taking the time to join us today. Our presenter today is Josefina Braña-Varela. She is a Senior Director of Forest and Climate here at WWF. Next slide, please. So before we begin, I'd like to go over a few logistics and some frequently asked questions. For those of you who have participated in past sessions, this will sound familiar. And yes, today's presentation is being recorded, and you can find the recording within a few days on our YouTube channel. To get to the recording, simply go to youtube.com and search for WWF Forest and Climate. There are two audio options today. You can listen through your computer or dial in through the phone number that was provided in your registration email. And it's important to note that if you experience audio difficulties while listening through your computer, those are sometimes caused by having too many browser windows or programs open at once. So feel free to close some of them, which usually solves the issue, or you're also always welcome to join by phone. And if you continue to have technical difficulties, please send me a message via the chat or the questions function, whichever is more easily accessible for you, and I'll try to get you sorted out. And on those lines, questions are absolutely welcome. You can send your questions anytime during the webinar using the toolbar on the screen, and we'll answer as many as possible during our allotted time. And after the webinar, you'll receive a link in your follow-up email with additional forest and climate resources from WWF, including a link to the YouTube channel where you can watch a recording of the session. So thank you all again for joining us today, and with that, we'll get started. Next slide, please. Josefina, it's all you.
Thank you, Emmeline, and hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. We are going to go over a series of topics in the presentation. We're going to talk about the reactions around the IPCC Special Report on Global Warming of 1.5 degrees. We're going to be talking about what happened around the Talanoa Dialogue, Ministerial Declaration Forest for Climate, and then we're going to go over the key highlights around the Paris Agreement Work Program, discussions during the COP in Katowice and the Paris Rulebook. We're going to end with other developments that happened beyond the UNFCCC. So let's get started. Next slide, please. Okay, so as many of you know, the IPCC Special Report on 1.5 degrees was released later last year before the COP in Katowice. And the report contained key messages around the need to accelerate action to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And the report found that we require major and immediate transformation, and also made some points about the scale of required low carbon transition, and how this level of effort that we need is going to be unprecedented. The report also mentioned different pathways or different options in which we could achieve limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, and these different scenarios obviously had trade-offs and different implications. But almost all of these pathways, or actually all the pathways, rely upon carbon removal to some extent. The report also explains how it is key that everybody, meaning countries, cities, the private sector, businesses, individuals, everybody needs to strengthen their action if we really want to meet the Paris Agreement goals. So that's a summary in a nutshell of what the report contained. But the surprise was in Katowice that many despite that many countries were supportive of the report, there were key countries like the US, Saudi Arabia, Russia, and Kuwait who chose not to have strong language or welcome the report and propose softer language around the potential language used in the COP decisions. So they proposed to use only taking note of the report, diminishing the importance of the findings. So this was disappointing, and of course, because of this move and this proposed weakening language, the negotiations under SOFSTA were delayed, and there was also an environment of tension and disappointment in the hallways. At the end, what happened is that the text of the COP does not welcome the report. It receives its timely conclusion, as you can see in the screen. That's the language that is used, and invites countries to use the report in subsequent decisions under the UNFCCC. This was really very tense moment in the negotiations. Also a clear signal that some countries are not ready to take on the responsibility and the ambition that is needed for us to meet the climate goals. So can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so in Katowice, also beyond the text negotiations of the rulebook, the Paris Rulebook, we had the discussions around the Talanoa dialogue. As you may remember, this dialogue was initially called facilitative dialogue, but when Fiji took the presidency of the COP, they used the word Talanoa, which is a traditional word used in Fiji to reflect a process of inclusive or participatory and transparent dialogue. So they wanted to have this dialogue as a mean to increase ambition and catalyze action. This was actually mandated by the Paris Agreement in 2015, in which countries agreed that they will come back in 2018 and take stock of their progress of climate action until date. And the idea was that this collective dialogue will help countries to assess the collective ambition and to increase their efforts and catalyze more ambitious action in the next round of submissions in the NDCs. So this was the idea, and what happened in the last COP in Katowice is that the COP took note of the outcome, inputs and results of the Talanoa dialogue, and the potential that this tool can have to generate greater confidence, value, ambition, and also invited the parties to consider them in the preparation of their NDCs and in their pre-2020 efforts. What happened in many countries is that they conducted their own Talanoa dialogues internally to have collective dialogues at the national level with different key stakeholders to try to understand how their efforts can add up to the country's ambition. We observed this happening in some countries, for example, in Latin America, in Peru and Colombia, where indigenous peoples and local communities were represented or invited to actually articulate their own contributions or their own efforts and how this needed to be recognized. If you go to the webpage of the UNFCCC, you can also find different submissions that many different stakeholders or countries themselves made regarding this topic of this Talanoa dialogue. I think what is most notable to point out here is that when tensions were arising in Katowice, there was a high ambition coalition that was formed there and that committed to increase their ambition by 2020, including the possible submissions of new NDCs. It was crucial to kind of reactivate optimism and to inject some energy to continue moving forward with the negotiations in a more positive note. So I think that was a positive development. Many European countries started, but then other countries followed. Right now, what we know is perhaps is not the most robust outcome in the COP, since the COP only took note of the outcome of inputs or submissions that were handed to the UNFCCC. But we can oversee the potential that this tool has in the following cycles of the Paris Agreement, because it could really inject more energy and optimism to the process, a little bit of good energy beyond the UNFCCC. So seeking greater ambition also can be re-emphasized at the UN Secretary General Summit in 2009. And this is the only conduit that we have to bring other inputs to the table, because as you know, in the UNFCCC is mostly about countries and governments representation, but with the Talanoa dialogue and other forums where we can include other non-state actors, I think we can catalyze and accelerate action, hopefully. The next slide, please. There was another development in Katowice, and this was an initiative by the Polish presidency. This was the Ministerial Declaration for Forest for the Climate. What the declaration included was pretty much a commitment to accelerate actions to ensure that the global contribution of forest and forest products is maintained, supported, and increased by 2050. And the declaration also encourages the scientific community to continue to explore and quantify the contribution of greenhouse gases, sinks, and reservoirs in managed lands, including forests, in order to achieve a balance between anthropogenic emissions in the second half of this century. And finally, it encourages non-state actors to continue showing their ambition and commitments in climate action related to forestry through the Global Climate Action Agenda, which, as many of you remember, is an initiative that runs from before Paris in the Lima COP. This Global Climate Action Agenda was launched as a way to include non-state actors into the process. I wanted to mention the declaration because it was a key, or let's say the most concrete outcome in terms of forest in Katowice, explicitly around forest. But in reality, as this was mostly an initiative from the Polish presidency, my assessment is that it didn't got too much traction in terms of triggering political will or any particular concrete, tangible outcome into the future. But we do know that around 69 countries endorsed the declaration. There was no reason for countries to really reject, as the text was not very controversial. But there was some other countries that didn't want to endorse it, as well as other stakeholders, pointing out that this declaration could be a way for the Polish presidency or countries similar to Poland that rely on coal as an energy source to try to make a case that they could offset their emissions from energy using forest as a tool to capture those emissions. So there was a little bit of controversy, but not too much. Again, I feel like this was, with or without the ministerial declaration, really was not going to make any difference in terms of the results of the COP. Can we go to the next one, please? So, okay. Now, what happened inside what is the proper negotiations in Katowice? As you know, countries were there to negotiate the Paris Rulebook. After Paris, we had different focus in terms of now making rules to operationalize the Paris Agreement. So this rulebook was mandated by COP21, which specifies the detailed areas to be developed before the first conference of the parties, serving as a meeting of the parties for the Paris Agreement. Countries didn't finish the Paris Rulebook in the previous COP, so they continue works throughout the year. So the Paris Rulebook was planned as a set of rules for the implementation of the Paris Agreement coming into force in 2020. And this was actually a complex task that includes several organisms or bodies of the UNFCCC. The ad hoc working group for the Paris Agreement, the subsidiary body for implementation, and SOBSTA, to move from the political commitment in Paris to the details for its implementation. What I can tell you is that this was adopted as a package in Katowice at the COP24, except for Article 6, which was postponed until COP25 in Santiago in a few months. So although we have the package, we know that there are still some things outstanding. Next slide, please. Okay, this is only to give you a visual idea of how complex were the discussions in Katowice. This is a diagram produced by the UNFCCC to show the different topics and the different bodies where things were discussed. And as you can see, we have several groups addressing or tackling the different pieces of the Paris Agreement, issues around the NDCs and mitigation, transparency, technology, global stock compliance, etc., were mostly in the Paris Agreement work program, but then you can see adaptation, where adaptation was discussed. Some portion of it, the national adaptation plans, was in SBI, but the rest was also either in the Paris Agreement working group or in the subsidiary bodies. So this is just to give you a sense of how complex were the discussions. But if we go to the next slide, please, you can also see the difficulty or the progression on the discussions since October and until COP in December. This is a chart produced by Carbon Brief, and I found it very interesting because you can see how the task at hand was very complicated. They had, I think, after in this intersessional in Bangkok in the fall last year, the text was around 307 pages. And then they the parties went to Katowice with 236 pages before the COP. So this was way more complicated, and it was a larger text than that one countries needed to work for the Paris Agreement itself. And I think the Carbon Brief reported that there were around 3,000 brackets at the beginning of the COP. In fact, you can see it in the graph. You see that the 3,000 brackets at the starting of the COP, and then you can see how issues were progressing throughout the days of the negotiations. It's interesting to see this chart because it shows the most controversial issues or the most difficult negotiations in Katowice. For example, you can see the voluntary market mechanism or the Article 6 market mechanisms discussions is the darker blue color. Those were the one of the most controversial negotiations, but also issues around the transparency framework under Article 13 were very, very controversial in terms of what are the things that countries needed to report, how often do we have different provisions, etc. So let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, let's talk about key highlights in terms of results regarding the rule book. Starting with the nationally determined contributions. One key issue to highlight is that right now we don't have differentiated resolutions for developed and developing countries. This means that we have equal requirements for all parties, but there is a provision, or the rule book allows countries to self-differentiate themselves, meaning that if you, as a country that has lower capacity, can have a different treatment or can send the information not at the same level of others if you justify and clearly explain why is the case. So in principle, you have the same set of rules for all countries, which is a different situation that we have in the past, where you have rules for Annex 1 countries and for non-Annex 1 countries. So the other key highlight to share with you is from 2031 and on, the time frame used for all NDCs should be the same. The number of years of the subsequent periods is still to be agreed in a later stage, But this is important because it will hopefully allow for more consistency in the nationally determined contributions that are sent to the UNFCCC. Because as many of you may remember, some current commitments or some current NDCs cover 5 years, while others were sent covering a period of 10 years. So this is fine for now, but once we reach 2031, that period, starting that period, the time frame should be the same for all. Also, now it is mandated that the NDCs may include adaptation or mitigation measures, which at the beginning was more focused on mitigation only. And it also developed the guidelines for information to facilitate clarity, transparency, and understanding, or what they are calling now ICTU for NDCs. And I think this is important because now we are going to have parameters that are similar for all countries, and this will allow us to have a better assessment of the collective effort that countries are having in terms of how all collectively report, and it's going to be easy for comparison. So these rules around what should be in these climate pledges, hopefully, will make it easier as we move forward to really, as I say, compare and have a global aggregate. Let's go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So in terms of carbon markets and voluntary cooperation, as many of you know, Article 6 of the Paris Agreement provides a framework for general cooperation in the implementation of the Paris Agreement and the NDCs. More precise provisions create a framework that will enable potentially an international carbon market. So this is not a new topic under the negotiations. The potential emergence of a carbon market has been in the table for many, many years, and it's always been very controversial and very, very difficult to get an agreement. So this was not the exception in Katowice. The negotiations were very complex and technical, in particular Article 6.2, where which is related to the cooperative approaches involving the ITMOs, or the international transfer of mitigation outcomes, and Article 6.4 related to the sustainable development mechanism, or similar to CDM mechanism. The negotiations were slow, were very, very tense. At some point, things were not moving forward. And I guess one of the most contentious issues was about the basic accounting rules to avoid double counting of emission reductions by the buyer and the seller. So meaning how a potential market mechanism will include certain safeguards or will promote highest environmental integrity. So we really know that the market mechanism is helping us to reduce emissions, and the atmosphere will see. And it really would be how can we make sure that emissions are really happening, but also if you are going to be trading these emissions, how we make sure that they are accounted for and deducted as appropriate in the accounting frameworks. So this issue of double counting or double accounting of emissions reductions was a big problem, and there was some discussions in terms of what are the rules of this potential CDM plus, for example, which was really a discussion dominated mainly by the government of Brazil, how these rules would allow or not developing countries to use, developing countries to use their emissions reductions towards their national determined contributions, while at the same time getting these emissions into a market mechanism. So these negotiations were really slow, and really was not an agreement. So if you see at the rule book, all the pieces were there, but this is still open. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so in terms of finance, what I can tell you is that now the developed countries shall communicate biannually the indicative, quantitative, and qualitative information, including the projected levels of public finance that will be provided to the parts of developing countries. This is good because now they have the requirement to communicate this information. Other countries that are not developed countries and who are providing finance are encouraged to do the same on a voluntary basis, but the developed countries have the commitment or the requirement. These rules say that countries should give an indication of what new and additional financial resources are going to be provided and how it has been determined that these resources are going to be additional. Unfortunately, this language, it's not, it doesn't mean that these characteristics are mandatory. So there's concerns about the additionality of finance, because we know that the levels of finance currently are not enough, and more finance is needed to actually scale up climate action. So this was disappointment. In terms of what is next for the reporting rules, in terms of finance in general, not for only developed countries, will be reviewed in 2023 again. So there's another chance to change to a more stringent language, hopefully into the future. Next slide, please. Okay. So now about the transparency framework. You may remember that the transparency framework refers to both action and support, and this was mostly focusing on the requirements of the reporting requirements for developing and developed countries in these both areas, action and support meaning finance. So as we said now in the previous slide, there's requirements for developed countries to share information about their financial contributions. But what about the rules for reporting in terms of actions, and what countries are actually doing, and if they are meeting or not their NDCs? This was, as I mentioned before, one of the main areas where countries fought to differentiate the rules for developed countries from developing countries. As we had in the previous climate regime, you will have clear commitments or requirements for Annex 1 countries, and developing countries were not mandated to provide certain types of information. Right now, what we have in the Paris Rulebook is a rulebook that applies to all, so all will have the same responsibilities in terms of reporting. And the framework right now describes what, how often, and in what level of detail countries should report on their climate efforts. Again, this is going to help us understand how are we doing collectively, because now we will have the same information, hopefully, for all countries at the same time, and hopefully getting into same periods of time, so we will have better information. The transparency framework covers guidance on how to report on emission levels, progress towards meeting climate pledges, adaptation, climate impacts, and climate finance provided or received. And it increases the level of information that will be needed to submit on a biannual basis. So again, this, as we know, before we didn't have the same clarity for, or the same requirements for all countries. Now all countries will have to submit the same type of information, but with the caveat that we have that in the rulebook, the allowance of this self-differentiation. Yeah, that means now we will have hopefully a reporting framework that will use common tables or common tabular format that will have to be developed by SOFSTA, by the way, and this will help us have a more consistent information. Now, I guess the last thing to say here is that the new reporting rules will kick in for all countries from 2024. So 1 year. This is going to be 1 year after the first global stocktake of progress. I will explain a little bit about the global stocktake progress, but this. The reason why these new rules will kick in at that point in time is that then we will have, for the first stocktake, we could base on less. Unfortunately, we won't have the complete or consistent information before the first global stocktake. But in the subsequent processes in the next global stocktakes, this common set of rules and way to report hopefully will allow us to have a better assessment of where are we collectively. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. So we now have, let's say, the blueprint for the machine to function. A colleague of mine always explains that the rule book is some sort of blueprint for the machinery of the Paris Agreement to tell us how it will function. But what we need is to power this mechanism, and the way the Paris Agreement designs their ambition mechanism or defines their power mechanism is through ambition. So we can have the machinery, but if we don't have the ambition of the countries, we are not going to get to meet our global goals. So part of what I explained before, the Talanoa dialogue, you can see in the slide in 2018, there's a box that says facilitative dialogue. That's what was later labeled as Talanoa dialogue. So that was the first time that countries came together collectively to assess their how far or how how far they are getting with their climate efforts. Excuse me. But the idea is that this won't only happen once last year with Talanoa dialogue, but it's going to happen every 5 years. So every 5 years, you will see the global stocktake happening, in which countries will come together and will take stock of progress towards the Paris goals. And then this global stocktake, with this assessment in hand, countries, or the assumption is that countries could go home and return, rework their climate pledges and return with enhanced ambition in their commitments to fill in the potential gaps that were detected. So this is the idea of the ambition mechanism. How it will happen in reality, well, we have to wait and see. But this is pretty much what the ambition mechanism supposedly was set to do. So every time this 5-year cycle is coming to an end, there will be a global stocktake to show how well or how bad countries are doing, detect those gaps. Countries will go back to their national constituencies. They will rework their national contributions, and they will come back with higher ambition to fill in those gaps. So as you know, we have under the Paris Agreement and the Paris Rulebook this progression principle, which means that countries will never be able to submit NDCs that are less ambitious than the previous one. So this is important because once you include certain information or once you include certain pool or sector in your NDC, you cannot take it down in a subsequent period. So this is hopefully helping countries to get closer to meet the Paris goals. Okay, so well, and then the last thing I want to say in this slide is, as I mentioned when I was explaining Talanoa dialogue, the idea is that this global stocktake or this collective discussion on how well the climate pledges are progressing in the context of the Paris Agreement, obviously the most important one is the collective global stocktake that will take place at the international level globally. But this is encouraged also to happen at national levels. So you can have also your own internal discussions on how well are you doing with the constituencies and different stakeholders, and be able to enhance climate action at the national level. Okay, so let's go to the next slide, please. This is going to be about other developments. So we now, I have given you a quick, very quick overview of what happened in Katowice. We do have a rule book in place. We do have a missing piece, which is provisions for Article 6 on market, especially on what it pertains to market approaches. But what happened in the last few months beyond the UNFCCC has also been quite important. And I wanted to share with you some thoughts. So the first one, I guess, is just a few days ago, the Green Climate Fund approved the first payment for results or results-based payments, applying the rules of the Warsaw Framework for REDD+. And the first proposal that was approved by the Green Climate Fund Board was the one presented by Brazil. Brazil presented a proposal offering, I think it was around 25 million tons of emissions reductions. At the end, the approved volume of emission reductions that was bought by the Green Climate Fund was a little bit under 20 million tons, which means that the proposal was approved for around $96 million. This also includes some a small payment for non-carbon benefits, which Brazil was managed to document. So non-carbon benefits were also included in this first payment. Excuse me. This is an important development because it's the first time that we are actually seeing finance flowing under one of the financial mechanisms of the Convention for Phase 3 of REDD+, or the Phase for results-based payments. And it's going to be interesting to see how this turns out to be implemented. As you know, because it's payment for results, that means that Brazil had to comply with all the rules set up in the Warsaw Framework for REDD+, and actually show that they have already produced some results. So the call for proposals, or the request for proposals under the pilot program of the GCF allowed for paying results in the past and some results that needed to happen in a period of time, in a current period of time. The other thing for you to know is, since it's a payment, it's going to be different. You're not getting money to actually implement a proposal. You're getting a payment for results that you achieved already. So the use of proceeds, how they call it, or how they use the money, it's something that is going to be interesting to follow up. Of course, Brazil had to show or include details on how the payments will be used, how these resources will be used. And Brazil, the government of Brazil, explained that they are putting forward public program, a pilot program, which they are calling Floresta Plus, which includes ecosystem restoration, but also payment for ecosystem services in the Amazon, which is where the results were achieved. And percentage of those of the payment will be used also to sustain and strengthen their REDD+ pieces, meaning the implementation of the strategy, their monitoring, measurement, and reportment system, and their safeguards information system. I think they also mentioned that they are putting in place South-South cooperation program as well. So that was one of the current developments that is very significant in terms of moving forward or meeting milestones that have taken a while, but finally we're seeing this happening. As I said, we will see. It's the first country that goes through this process, so we'll have to keep an eye on and see how this is working. The other development that was very significant in the last few months is, as some of you may remember, the government of Norway and Indonesia had signed a bilateral agreement back in 2010, where Norway pledged to support Indonesia with $1 billion US dollars, depending on results tackling deforestation in Indonesia. So far, very little flow of finance has happened from Norway to Indonesia, mainly because Indonesia hasn't been able to demonstrate that they are actually achieving emission reductions from deforestation. So right now, what happened is, for the first time in these 9 years, there is a decrease in deforestation. Apparently, in the period of 2016-2017, the Indonesian government is reporting emissions reductions for around 5 million tons. And pending verification, what I know is that they are carrying out an independent verification of these results. But if this happens, then there will be a significant payment to Indonesia for this 5 million ton reduction. I think that could be, I haven't seen the amount in any official communication, but if we take into consideration that is more or less $5 per ton, that could be around $25 million for Indonesia in the coming months. Another development we saw is under the carbon fund. The Forest Carbon Partnership Facility Carbon Fund has also been trying to incentivize and promote emissions reductions programs. And in the past 6 years, we've seen countries trying to meet the criteria and the requirements and the rules for the methodological framework, and ongoing certain preparation processes. But it's only until now that we are seeing actual tangible movement, because last year, I think by September, we have 2 countries moving forward with signature of an emissions reductions purchase agreement. That's how they call it, where donors to the carbon fund will buy these emission reductions from countries. So the 2 countries that signed purchase agreements were DRC back in September, and then Mozambique early this year in February. So DRC and Mozambique are the 2 first countries signing these purchase agreements under the FCPF and the Carbon Fund. We know also that there is another country negotiating right now with the donors to the Carbon Fund, and that's Chile. And there are 2 countries on pre-negotiations, which are Ghana and Mexico. So things are starting to move. We have a period of 6 years where we couldn't see any country meeting the requirements, but it seems like now countries are, the pipeline is starting to fill in with countries ready to sign. Okay, and finally, I just wanted to mention or flag for you the one event that is going to be of relevance this year, which is the UN Secretary General Summit in September 2019, where the Secretary General is trying to really rally up and create momentum for climate, for continuous climate commitments and increased action. And this summit is hopefully going to be able to catalyze higher political commitments and ambition. And it's going to be organized around different sectors or constituencies. You will see a pillar that is going to be focused on energy. Another pillar is going to be focused on businesses. And there's a couple of pillars that are relevant for you, people interested in forests, which are the pillar on nature-based solutions. This pillar is going to be led by the UN Environment Program. And then you will have another pillar of work focused on adaptation and resilience, which also obviously includes a very strong component or content on forests. And this adaptation and resilience track or pillar is going to be led by the UNDP. So one of the key issues around the summit will be to continue to bring non-state actors to the center of the climate action. So that's why you will see a strong focus on businesses, but also indigenous peoples and local communities that will be connected to this climate action to recognize their efforts. We hope to see that anyways. So preparations are underway, and we hope to see that this is going to be a good political moment to continue to build a strong momentum for the forest and climate agenda. Okay, so if we can go to the next slide, and with that I will conclude. Okay, so we have, as I mentioned to you, the Paris Agreement Rulebook has been finalized with the exception of the rules and modalities for Article 6. This is important because there may be implications depending on what is decided on Article 6. There may be some additions that need to be made to the transparency framework in terms of reporting and the type of information, because if we want to promote environmental integrity and avoid double counting, certainly if a market agreement or a mechanism that will allow transferences will require information that is very strong and transparent to make sure that the atmosphere is seeing benefits. So discussions about voluntary international cooperation will likely increase the requirements for participating countries. So it's a little bit of what I was explaining. It's unsure who can participate, or if it's so far it's obviously all on a voluntary basis. But if you're going to participate, then probably you will have additional requirements that will be added. Non-state actors seeking to align themselves to the goals of the Paris Agreement presents both opportunities and challenges. I think opportunities is regarding to all hands on deck and bringing all efforts to align towards the same goal. It's very powerful. Challenges, we don't have a system, or we don't have clarity on how these non-state actors' efforts plug in or align, for example, to nationally determine contributions. So these are things that we need to start thinking about and understanding what are the right incentives mechanisms to bring these other stakeholders to the table. And finally, the discussions around attaining a just transition, this term just transition, have intensified. And I feel like we've seen in the last few months some developments in terms of strong leadership or some leadership of government saying, yes, we are committed to the Paris Agreement goals, and then some stakeholders at the national level that are not getting the right support for having this transition to a low carbon development world. So these discussions about promoting and ensuring a just transition for all, for example, for workers that are currently in the energy sector, what are the type of alternatives for these workers, or workers that are working in very bad conditions in coal mines, etc. So all these issues around just transition are starting to emerge, and we hope to see more action to ensure this at the local level. With that, I will end, and I think we have a few minutes for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Josefina. We do still have a few minutes for questions, and I have some, but for those of you who are listening, if you have something you'd like to ask Josefina, now is your moment. The first question I want to ask is circling back to the markets mechanism. Can we expect a resolution on that markets issue in Article 6 by the next COP? And what do you think those expected results might be?
Thanks, Emeline. Definitely this topic is in the agenda for COP25 in Chile. We don't, there's no guarantees that the countries will actually come into a resolution. If you remember the slide I presented with the carbon brief graph that shows how contentious and how many brackets, which is an indicator of how much disagreement there is around the topic, you can see how complex the discussions are at the moment. So, I mean, definitely it's in the agenda for COP25. We don't know if the parties will come into an agreement then, or if this will get dragged to further discussions. I guess the expectations, I mean, what we expect to see is an agreement on how these internationally transferred mitigation outcomes will work, like what are the rules for transfer mitigation outcomes or emissions reductions. In a way, for me, my expectation is that there's very, very strong environmental integrity, that there is clear provisions for benefit sharing, and that we have a way to promote or to really track down very transparently what is happening with emissions, so we don't fall into double counting. But we, again, will have to wait and see to understand these rules for the Sustainable Development Mechanism and how the ITMOs plug in or not into this mechanism.
Thank you. Were there any updates from this COP on the loss and damage mechanism?
The loss and damage mechanism, certainly there were discussions around the issue. I think in the graph I show you from the UNFCCC, well, I actually don't remember if it reflected that, but there were discussions about loss and damage. Again, I think there hasn't been clear dispositions or steps on what has happened or how loss and damage will be treated. I think depending where you stand, there are many expectations to get more clarity on how loss and damage mechanism will work and how resources and support will flow. But the reality is that it's always, in my opinion, falls a little bit short. But in the materials that we will send as a follow-up from the presentation, you can see a document that has more information about that.
Thank you. Do you expect REDD+ in any way to be coming in under Article 6.2? Any explicit mention? And then, yeah, because of that, does forestry need to be explicitly included in the NDCs?
Yeah, I mean, those are two great questions. First, the one on how are we expecting to see 6.2 rather than 6.2? This is unclear at the moment. There's been many different approaches. There's people that want to see REDD+ or forest explicitly mentioned in 6.2. There's other approaches that prefer not to call out any sector, but actually to create rules or guidance that will work for all sectors without distinction. And you will have people that don't explicitly want to exclude forests from that. Some of them because they feel like forests will be used as an excuse for inaction. Some of them said if it's not explicitly there, there would be no incentives for forests to be considered in a market mechanism. So there's many divergent positions on this. I think from my observer's opinion is you want to create a mechanism that is robust for all sectors. Without exception. So I don't see, I think if we try to exclude or include explicitly forest, then there is less chance that we will have a resolution on the issue. And if you maintain it, the guidance or the decisions applicable for all sectors, I think it would be easier for everybody to reach an agreement. But that's only my opinion as an observer. And then the other question about including forest in NDCs, I think regardless of what happens with markets or the Sustainable Development Mechanism and Article 6, we have to promote countries to include forest in their NDCs. it's going to be super important for meeting the Paris Agreement that the sector is actually included and actively supported to fulfill both the role as, to tackle the deforestation as a mean to reduce emissions, but also to promote forest conservation as a way to enhance and conserve and consolidate the carbon sinks that we have. As I mentioned at the beginning, all IPCC scenarios and pathways contemplate one way or another carbon removal as a must-have piece of it. And we definitely want to have trees as our best carbon removal technology, because other more artificial technologies are unproven and we don't know what the consequences are. So for me, including forests in NDCs it has to be, it's good because it can channel finance and support to those countries that include forests in their NDCs for implementation of these activities, and it's going to be good for countries to be in control of their carbon flows as well. So definitely we should be aiming for that.
Thank you. Is there any more information from the discussions around the transparency framework about the level of detail that will be asked from developed and developing countries in relation to forests?
Well, right now, the information, it's not, again, it's not, it doesn't have any distinctions, in particular for forest or any other sector. These are rules that apply for all sectors, and it talks about sinks and reservoirs. And I think what is important to know is that countries will need to start understanding how or what this guidance means in terms of implementation. We had a very interesting workshop with the forest countries to try to track down what they have put in NDCs and what kind of information, how they can trace back these mitigation options to their greenhouse gas inventories or not, which kind of indicators you are using. And the fact is that there are many gaps in terms of what countries put in NDCs and what is the data and information that will allow them to track the progression of their NDCs. So there is nothing in particular for forest in the rule book, but definitely in the operationalization or in the implementation of the rule book, there will be many things that are particularly interesting for forest or needed, or gaps of information or data that needs to be there.
Thank you. I have a finance question up next. So this participant writes that, it's recognized that forests are critical to meet climate goals, but they receive only 2% of climate finance. How can we explain this paradox, and what can be done to increase funding for forest protection and for sustainable agriculture?
Yes, that's a great question, and we've seen this more actually backed with the research with the New York Declaration on Forest Assessment reports, that the level of finance dedicated to a sector that could contribute, a sector meaning the land sector, could contribute to 30% of the solution for climate, and this is puzzling, and definitely we need to do a better effort in terms of communicating why this sector is important, and to promote that it's really supported and tackled. I think one issue that has been emerging more consistently is this issue of trying to create coherence within the land sector. And if you take a look at the volumes of finance that are going to agriculture, whether it's sustainable or unsustainable, it doesn't matter. The volume of finance going to agriculture is huge in comparison to what is going to forest protection. So one thing to do is create this coherence internally in the land sector, and to make sure that obviously agriculture is supported, because we really need to continue to feed the planet, but done in the most efficient way in terms of not creating deforestation, but actually looking at a more a better planning to understand where are the best lands for agriculture, and how we can protect currently the left standing forests that are going to be our carbon sinks for the future. So this creation of coherence, and also, as I mentioned, the role of non-state actors needs to be in alignment. It's not only governments, but actually big businesses which produce commodities, they also need to take action and responsibility in terms of sourcing from places and understanding where are they causing deforestation. So they need to stop, and they need to work with their suppliers to get a better way to produce, which is not in detriment of forests and ecosystems.
Thank you. We just have time for one last question. When do you think we'll get detailed guidelines for the information that countries will have to provide in their NDC, specifically regarding land and the forest sector?
So you already have guidance that is out there in the decisions. I mentioned the ICTU. I guess the information that is going to be needed to provide by country. So this information is already there. There are some pieces left, as I mentioned, that they will need to be developed by SOFSTA in terms of the tabular, the matrix that is going to be used to provide information. There are some pieces that are left to be developed by the COP, but in general, the rules of reporting for the transparency framework, as I mentioned, for action and support, are already there. These are rules that would be applicable for all sectors, including forest and land. So far, there hasn't been any specific rules anticipated for forests, but as I mentioned, if things change, things evolve with the Article 6 discussions, there may be explicit reference for forests and different explicit requirements for forests. But so far, what we have is a common set of rules for all sectors and all parties, which is already there in the Paris Rulebook text.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Josefina, for coming and talking with us today. We've come to the end of our time today. Next slide, please. So I really want to thank you for sharing your expertise with our community. I know I always learn something when I watch these presentations, and I get to talk to you almost every day. And thank you all to the participants for joining and sending us in your thoughtful and engaging questions. There were a few that we weren't able to get to during this time, so I'll circle back with Josefina and see if we can provide some written responses to some of those. And you'll all receive a follow-up email in about an hour with some additional resources that are specific to this webinar. Next slide, please. And if you want to revisit this webinar or share it with colleagues or anyone you think would be interested, the recording will be up on the Forest and Climate YouTube channel, hopefully by the end of today, if not tomorrow. And you can also find recordings of previous sessions there for additional enrichment. Next slide, please. So thank you all again for joining us, and we hope you have a wonderful day.